Assembly Number 777, Rules 6, Mr. Carroll. Concurrent resolution of the Senate and Assembly proposing an amendment to Section 5 of Article 2 of the Constitution.
On a motion by Mr. Carroll, the Senate bill is before the House. The Senate bill is advanced. Read the last section. Nope.
This act shall take effect immediately.
Sorry. Explanation is requested by Mr. Goodell.
Good evening. This bill would eliminate the provision in the New York State Constitution that requires a voter to register to vote at least 10 days prior to an election.
Mr. Goodell,
Would the sponsor yield?
will you yield, Mr. Carroll?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you very much. Now, if this, well, first of all, let me back up. Right now, under the Constitution, you have to register at least 10 days before the election, correct?
Yes.
And did you look at the legislative history, the constitutional history, as to why we have that 10-day requirement?
Why do we have it, Mr. Goodell?
Well, I believe it's so that we can ensure that those who vote in the election have been properly vetted by our boards of elections. Are you aware of other reasons?
Well, I am also aware that we've had some advances in technology recently, and I think that we will make sure once we pass this constitutional amendment, not just this year, but 2 years from now, and when the people of the state of New York then vote it into our Constitution, that we will be able to come up with a framework and enacting legislation to make sure that all of those who wish to register to vote are actually able to vote.
Of course, we're not at the implementation phase
We are
yet.
not.
But would it be your objective, if this passes in 2 consecutive legislature and whatever, that an individual could show up for the first time on the day of the election, register to vote, and cast their vote?
Yes.
And where would they show up to register? Would they show up at the Board of Elections office?
Well, I think that would be the enacting legislation and that this body would decide that. But yes, I could see either going to your local polling place and being able to register to vote right there, or there could be a scheme that says one would have to go to their local Board of Elections in their county to register to vote if they were to decide to register on the day of the election itself.
And then you envision instantaneous voter registration updates so that the polling places would know that this individual registered at
I
whatever
envision
4
that
o'clock?
and many other things.
What's that?
I envision that and many other things.
I see. And of course, as we all know, the election day is the busiest day of the year for the Board of Elections. In my district, there are 99 election districts. So they would register them on that day, calculate which of the 99 election districts they're in, give them a provisional or an absentee or an affidavit ballot at that point in time?
Yes, presumably they would be able to do that.
I see. And does this bill provide any funding to the boards of elections for the necessary staff or technological updates or anything of that nature?
Mr. Gill, this is the first step in a 2-year process. This body and the state Senate will be able to draft and review the enacting legislation. As you know full well, even though the constitutional minimum is 10 days, currently in law it is actually 25 days that you must register prior to an election. And so I believe this body will be able to take that under advisement and make sure that we bring same-day registration to the state of New York. Because what I think is most important here, and what I think many people in this body believe, is that you have a constitutional right to vote. And we should not put any arbitrary impositions on that right to vote. And a person who is eligible to vote should be able to go to their polling place or go to their county board of elections and be able to vote that day, because that is their right as a U.S. citizen.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. On the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Goodell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Certainly, I agree with the sponsor that we want to encourage people to vote. But a fundamental challenge of our voting system is to ensure that people vote in the right district, using the right ballot, that they're duly eligible, and they're qualified. Our Constitution currently requires at least 10 days to verify where they live. And here in many of our districts, you have multiple overlapping jurisdictions with different ballots. So you might be in one town with two different fire districts, different county legislative districts, different assembly districts even. And so it's not necessarily a simple process for the Board of Elections to determine on the spot, on the busiest day of the year, while they're handling everything else, which is a correct election district for you. And it is almost impossible for them to accurately verify your background information. And so certainly we want to encourage people to register and vote, no question about that. But fundamental to any democratic system is that we only have the right eligible voters voting in the right district using the right ballots. Because when we don't have assurance that the individuals are properly registered where they belong and they are, who they claim to be, then we have more problems with voter fraud, and we undercut the democratic system. Right now, as correctly pointed out by my colleague, state law requires 25 days. Before we go to 0, we could always consider, by the way, as an alternative, reducing to 25 and see if our boards of election can bring their technology and their processing up to speed. For that reason, I and some of my colleagues have concerns about the implementation of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the bill, Mr. Ra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Will yield, Mr. Carroll.
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you. So if we could just take a step back for a second in terms of voter registration as it's currently done. Now, I know there's that 25-day requirement in existing law.
Yes.
When an individual who wishes to enroll to vote fills out the voter registration form, they provide a couple of items of information to the Board of Elections that then will allow them to verify who the person is, that they live where they say there is. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and that includes, I believe, either a driver's license number or a portion of a Social Security number?
Yes.
And then it also requires a box be checked that confirming that they're a citizen and
Yes.
thus eligible to vote. So do you know what the Board of Elections then does with that information with the 25 plus days
Mr. Ra, I
they
don't
have?
work for the Board of Elections, nor have I ever worked for the Board of Elections.
But you
what
are
I
trying
do
to
know,
make a change in the voting.
Yes, but what I do know is that the technology exists to make sure that we can verify who a person is and whether they are eligible to vote. And again, we're talking about a constitutional right here. And what you and Mr. Goodell have continually brought forth this evening are clerical and bureaucratic impediments to that constitutional right. So what I think is much more important is to make sure that the Board of Elections can get on the level of the Constitution and not the other way around.
Well, I agree with you, it's a constitutional right, but it's a constitutional right for every single one of us. So if somebody comes and votes that is not supposed to be voting, they're canceling out somebody else's vote and disenfranchising that
I don't
person
think that's
as well.
how constitutional rights work, but okay.
So if my constitutional rights, okay, well, we'll agree to disagree on that. Constitutional rights, you can protect each individual's constitutional rights. It doesn't have to be.
And that is exactly what this bill is doing.
Okay,
this
but
bill is protecting every single New Yorker's constitutional right, those who are eligible to vote. We should not put up any false barrier to someone's ability to go out and vote because of a time requirement, which is purely based on bureaucracy. All of your arguments are around that can the Board of Elections actually be able to register someone to vote? And I think yes. And what we should not do is throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we're not sure, so you know what? Let's just put a line in the sand and say, let's wait 10 days, 25 days. Hey, why not a year?
I don't think anybody's arguing for that, but we have 25 days in statute. This is taking away the 10-day requirement. Okay, so moving on, and I guess we're going to disagree on that factor that if somebody does come and vote who's not supposed to be voting, that is, I believe, disenfranchising other eligible voters. But we'll agree to disagree on that point. So one of the things that the Board of Elections does have the ability to do then, they go back, they put the person into their system, and as we all know, and we talked about this with the pre-registration, as an eligible election comes up, we send out these voter cards, correct?
Yes.
And one of the things that I know happens is sometimes those voter cards get returned. And now there's perhaps it's just, an honest reason it's returned, or perhaps that person is no longer living at that address. It does provide some level of check. What do you believe? I know there's going to be some type of enabling legislation. This is just the constitutional piece of it. But what do you envision would be the process when this person comes in for the same-day registration? Would they show some form of ID, or would they just fill out a form?
Mr. I don't plan to decide hypothetically what this legislature is going to do in 2 years. We don't even know the makeup of what this body will be. What we're deciding right now is this enacting legislation. And again, though, you keep falling back on the idea that a bureaucratic process should get in the way of a constitutional right, and I just don't believe in that.
I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that we need to be able to verify the person coming forward. Now,
there are consistent ways that the Board of Elections, you mentioned 2 of them, one, your Social Security number, or a New York State ID through your driver's license, are 2 ways that we've been able to verify. I am sure in the 21st century, in 2021, when this would actually come into effect, that between the Department of State, the Board of Elections, and all of the apparatuses in New York State, that we would be able to find a way to make sure that we could verify a voter. And then, if we couldn't, we could very easily create a provisional ballot situation where that person's eligibility could be checked after the election and counted as if it were an absentee ballot or an emergency ballot. So there are a multitude of ways that we could do this. But I think yourself and Mr. Goodell are deciding to kind of narrow down and drill down on the most picayune and pedantic points to make sure that we get bureaucracy, again, in the way of constitutional rights.
Yeah, well, I don't agree that that's what we're doing at all. We're trying to ensure that there's a process that can be done correctly to make sure we verify that people who are eligible to vote can vote, and people that are not eligible to vote cannot. So you just mentioned the last question I have. Do you envision that this would be somebody who could come in and then vote on the machine, or would it be some type of affidavit or provisional ballot situation?
Again, it would be presumptuous of myself to assume how we would do that. That's a decision for this entire body. That's a decision for 2 years from now. But yes, I could envision either scenario.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Carroll. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Ra.
So this is a constitutional amendment. I don't think we should make, the provisions in our Constitution overly wordy, but I do believe that we should, as we're doing this, have some idea of how this process is going to work. What happens when you register in advance, there are several checks there, because if you've filled out that paperwork in advance, you're now given a signature that they're going to have on file. There's some information that can be verified. There's the voter card, as opposed to the person comes in that day. There's not really kind of 2 levels involved. There's only one. So there are a lot of concerns with this. It has nothing to do with trying to put up bureaucratic barriers, but it does have to do with making sure that people, again, who are eligible to vote are able to vote, and people who are not eligible to vote do not vote. We disagree on the point, but I believe that if somebody comes in and votes who is not supposed to vote, I think that is disenfranchising other voters, because it could be canceling out their vote. So I think many people here have a concern about this. I'm going to be casting my vote in the negative, and I think for those same reasons, many of my colleagues will as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johns.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. On the bill?
On the bill, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I plan on voting for most of these voter reforms. I think I voted for the first 2 or 3. I have a little problem with this one because I just don't think same-day registration or 1 day in advance of the vote is really enough time to do a background check. And I would refer to another constitutional right besides voting. I don't own a gun, never have, but I see legislation that says that we're going to go to a 10-day background check for guns. So no one can buy a gun until they go in and try and purchase it and wait for a 10-day background check. I don't think a 10-day background check, if someone's going to purchase a gun, is any different than going to a 10-day background check to see if someone's eligible to vote. We want to make sure that in both cases there's no fraud. The people that shouldn't vote, and people that shouldn't have a gun or a weapon should not have a gun or a weapon. And to take an extra 10 days to make sure that that happens, I don't think is unreasonable. So I'll be voting no for this particular piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. John. Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
The clerk will record the vote. Mr. Ortiz to explain his vote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am standing here today to congratulate and to thank the sponsor of this piece of legislation. 10 days on one day, I think is very important and very critical that we give the voters the opportunity that if they choose to vote the same day, they should be registering and voting the same day. And I think this bill is a step in the right direction. I think we have a lot that we have done today about the LLC, which is another important piece of legislation, and also engaging our new generation by allowing them to register at the age of 16. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Speaker, the sponsor of this bill, for giving us this wonderful piece of legislation, and I hope that we can see the day where we can register the same day and vote in the same day. Thank you.
Mr. Ortiz in the affirmative. Are there any other votes? Mr. Mantelau to explain his vote.
I'd like to explain my vote. We've talked about this for quite a little bit here today, and I appreciate the process of this and where we want to go. But this is what I see from the local level. We've talked about several different bills here, and each time, yep, we're going to take care of it. Yes, we're going to take care of it. We're putting all this burden back on our local Board of Elections. And by the way, we're not funding it. As a former county legislator and a town supervisor, I do know that every time you add one of these pieces of bills back to our local people, we've got to take care of that. And not having an answer of, well, we'll work it out. Well, we work it out. That doesn't always work. It definitely does not work from the state level down to the local municipalities and governments. So we've got to find a way of funding these things as we move forward, because right now our county budgets are so tight underneath the tax cap. In doing so, and every time we add one other thing to that mission of these people, we're adding more cost to the local governments. And we want to keep the costs down. We want to keep people here. We want to be able them to do so. So I'm going to vote no on this, only because there's no explanation of how we're going to fund it, who's going to do it, and, oh, by the way, we'll fix it later. That does not work. Thank you.
Mr. Mantelau in the negative. Welcome to the New York State Legislature, sir. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 97, noes 38.
The bill is passed.